Alright guys, this is section P.6 having to do with complex numbers. We talked about this last year in Honors Algebra 2, whether you had me or Mr. Piccirillo. Complex numbers are imaginary. Imaginary numbers are square roots of negative numbers. So for example, as you can see here, the square root of -1 equals I. If you had something like the square root of -9, okay, that would be the square root of 9 times the square root of -1. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of -1 is I. So that's how we do that. Now, when you do operations with imaginaries, it's basically just combining like terms. So if you had something like 2 plus I minus 9I minus 3, that's an I, you would just literally combine like terms. Now remember, if there's a minus in front of the parentheses, that's almost like you have to subtract that whole thing. So it would really be 2 plus I minus 9I plus 3. Okay. Now combine like terms. 2 plus 3 is 5. I minus 9I is minus 8I. Notice the constant term comes first, the I term comes second. Okay, standard form for an imaginary number, or a complex number in this case, is A plus BI. So make sure that, again, the regular number comes first and then your I term comes second. One other thing to talk about. Okay, we said that I equaled the square root of -1. Well, you may run into a situation where you have an I squared. Well, if you have an I squared, all you have to do is square both sides. So the I would become I squared. If you square the square root of -1, you just get -1. So when you see an I squared, you can substitute -1 in for that. Now, if you look at I to the third, okay, what we would do is we would break down I to the third as I squared times I. Well, I squared is already -1, so you'd have -1 times I. Well, -1 times I is just -I. So anytime you have an I and you're squaring it or cubing it or even raising it to the fourth power, I mean, if you raised it to the fourth power, you'd have I squared times I squared. But again, I squared is -1, so -1 times -1 is 1. So if you ever saw, for example, an I to the fourth, you would just plug in 1 for that, because that's really what it equals. So just a real quick little aside here with the exponents for I, because you might see those. Now, if you have to multiply, okay, oh, whoops, erase that. So if you're multiplying, let's say you're multiplying something like, something like this. So square root of -4 plus I times 6 minus 5I. Now, first thing you want to do is you want to simplify. The square root of -4 is 2I. Now you can combine like terms. 2I plus I is 3I. Alright, at this point now you want to distribute. So you've got 3I times 6 is 18I. And then 3I minus 5I, 3I times minus 5I is minus 15I squared. Because remember, I times I is I squared. Rules for exponents. But we just said on the previous slide that I squared is -1. So I have 18I minus 15 times -1. We substitute -1 in for I squared. So I really have 18I. Now -15 times -1 is plus 15. But again, our standard form for complex numbers, the I term comes second. So our final answer, and I'm running out of room here, I apologize. You'd actually switch these two terms, your answer would be 15 plus 18I. Now, it doesn't always happen where you get something like the square root of -4 that you can just reduce. If that happens, if that were just a regular number, you would do FOIL. Okay, you would just do FOIL on the parentheses, combine like terms. You'd wind up getting an I squared. Make sure you substitute -1 in for that. Now, in a situation where you have to do something where you have something like this. Well, obviously that's 1 minus I times 1 minus I times 1 minus I. So then you would just have to do distributive property twice, okay? And you probably will get some I to the third. So you'd get, for example, if you did these two, you would get 1 minus 2I plus I squared times 1 minus I. And then you would take the 1 and distribute it through. So 1 minus 2I plus I squared, and then take the negative I and multiply that through. So you'd get minus I plus 2I squared, and then minus I to the third. Well, if you combine like terms, okay, you've got a 1, and that's really all you have for right now. Minus 2I minus I is minus 3I. I squared plus 2I squared is plus 3I squared, and then minus I to the third. So let's go to the next. Actually, we can do it down here. We still have a little bit of room. Again, I squared is -1. So I plug in -1 for I squared. Now, I to the third, okay, we talked about a couple slides ago. I to the third is really just I. Okay, because I to the third, actually it's negative I, excuse me. Because I to the third we broke down, I squared was -1 times I. So, if we go to the next slide, we have 1 minus 3I. Go back here for a second. Positive 3 times -1, -3. One more time, we'll go back. Minus -I, which really turns into plus I. So now if I combine like terms, 1 minus 3 is -2, -3I plus I is minus 2I, and this is our answer. We should never get an answer with an exponent for I. If we get that, we have to reduce it, break it down, and I showed you how to do that a couple slides ago. So when you have to do that, make sure it's in complex form. This is the complex number. So when they talk about complex numbers, that's what they're talking about. Okay, what happens if you get a situation where you have a fraction and then you get something like 2 minus I on the bottom? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to multiply by something called the complex conjugate. And what that is we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by the opposite of 2 minus I. Well, the opposite of 2 minus I, the complex conjugate of 2 minus I is 2 plus I. Because just like a square root, you can't have a square root in the denominator of a fraction. Same goes for complex numbers. No i's in the bottom. If you have an I in the bottom, you have to multiply by its opposite, or its complex conjugate in this case. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'll reset this up. Well, all you're going to do is multiply. So you're going to do I times 2, which is 2I. I times I is plus I squared. We'll reduce this all out in a second. Here, I get 4 plus 2I minus 2I minus I squared. As you can see, the middle terms cancel out, and you're left with 4 minus I squared. But again, I squared equals -1. So I have 2I minus 1, because that turns into -1, plus -1 is -1. And here, this becomes a -1, minus -1 becomes a positive, 4 plus 1 is 5. And again, on top, the regular number, the constant has to come first, so we have to switch the terms. We have a real number on the bottom, so that would be our answer, -1 plus 2I over 5. If you had something, if you just had like a 3 over 4i real quick, okay, all you'd have to do, whoops, erase that. All I would do is multiply top and bottom by I, because this 4 is okay. It's 4 times I, so you don't have to worry about the 4 in that situation. Just multiply by I, so you have 3i over 4i squared. But again, I squared is -1, so 3i over -4 would be your answer. Because again, I squared is -1, and you'd multiply that. For the last problem, all I'm going to say, for the last type of problem you're going to have to do, they're going to ask you to solve a quadratic. Most likely, guys, you're not going to be able to factor that. So use the quadratic formula. All right. And what's probably going to happen is you're going to wind up getting a negative underneath the square root sign. So you will have to use I when you take the square root. So that's pretty much all you have to know for P.6. Hope you guys get a lot done tomorrow. Make sure you work together. And I'll be back Tuesday, and we can go over that and start talking about P.7. All right? Take care, guys.